I was driving past my son-in-law's place when I thought I'd swing by to see how he was doing. But then I spotted my wife's car, parked right by the gate, a gleaming silver Lexus that should have been sitting in our own garage. A cold knot twisted in my stomach. Something's off, I thought, easing my way toward the house, careful not to draw attention. What I overheard through that window would burn itself into my memory forever. When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for. Victoria's voice floated out through the half-open pane, each word dripping into me like acid. I froze there in my Honda outside Samantha's house, the engine still running, my keys dangling. Just 5 minutes earlier, I'd called my daughter to surprise her with dinner. "Sorry, Dad, I'm not home. But Ethan's there working on some case files," she'd said, all chipper. And yet here was Victoria's Lexus, sitting bold as brass in the driveway. I cut the engine and walked up on legs that suddenly felt unsteady. Peeking through the small opening in the curtains, I saw her. My wife of 25 years sprawled on Samantha's couch like she owned the place, and Ethan leaning against the bookshelf with that smug little grin I'd grown to hate. "The timeline's perfect," Ethan was saying, his voice crisp with that lawyer's confidence. "File in June, claim irreconcilable differences. Under the new Iowa statutes, Victoria gets half of everything acquired during the marriage, plus lifetime spousal support." Victoria chuckled, that delicate tinkling laugh I once thought was sweet. "The construction business alone is worth $12 million, she said. Add in the rentals, the vacation home, the investments. We're looking at close to $20 million total," Ethan concluded. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my phone, hitting record just in time to catch the rest. The best part? His trusting nature. Henry has no clue we've been cataloging his assets for months. Bank statements, deeds, valuations. We've got copies of everything. Ethan continued, pointing toward a manila folder on the coffee table. He practically handed us the keys to his kingdom. Victoria examined her manicured nails. 2 years of playing the devoted wife, she said, pretending to be interested in his dull construction stories, nodding along when he stressed about payroll. God, the man actually believes I love him. A dry twig cracked under my shoe. They both stopped talking instantly, their heads swiveling toward the window. My heart thudded hard enough to feel in my throat as I pressed myself against the brick wall, the April air suddenly too warm. "Did you hear that?" Victoria asked sharply. "Probably just the neighbor's cat," Ethan said after a moment. "You're getting jumpy. Can you blame me if Henry found out before we were ready? He won't." Ethan cut her off, his tone dripping with contempt. "The man couldn't spot a setup if it wore a neon sign. By September, you'll be divorced, rich and free to do whatever and whoever you want." I stayed still, letting my phone soak up every poisonous word. 15 minutes later, I slipped on back into my car. My entire life had just been turned upside down. 25 years of marriage reduced to a legal strategy session between my wife and my son-in-law. That folder on the coffee table haunted me. While I'd been grinding out 16-hour days building our future, they'd been methodically plotting its destruction. I sat there gripping the wheel with the same hands that had built a construction empire from scratch. The same hands that had given Victoria every comfort she'd ever had. The same hands that walked her down the aisle when her own father refused. And her words echoed, "God, the man actually believes I love him." Worst of all, until half an hour ago, I actually did. Just as I reached for my keys, the front door swung open. Victoria came out first, her designer handbag swinging casually, followed by Ethan adjusting his tie like he was posing for a portrait. Neither of them expected me to be sitting there in my Honda, and the shock on Victoria's face hit me like a slap. "Henry," she blurted, her voice an octave higher than normal. "What are you doing here?" I kept my expression as neutral as I could, even though my pulse was pounding. 25 years together had taught me to read her moods, but now I knew she'd been acting the whole time. Just wrapped up an inspection nearby, I lied easily, climbing out of the car. Thought I'd stop in and see Samantha. Ethan stepped in closer to Victoria, almost like a guard dog, that sharp attorney's instinct flicking on. Those pale gray eyes of his locked on mine, scanning for any weakness in my story. "She's not here," Victoria said quickly. I was helping Ethan sort through some legal files for one of his clients." The lie slid out of her mouth like she'd been rehearsing it for years. How many of these smooth little falsehoods had I swallowed without ever questioning? "Oh," I said lightly, keeping my tone casual. "I thought you were working until 6 today. Didn't you tell me this morning you had something going on with the Henderson proposal?" For a moment, panic flickered in her eyes before she smoothed it over. "I left early. Headache. Sorry to hear that." I turned to Ethan, forcing a friendly smile. "Interesting case you're on." "Case? Asset division," he said, without thinking, then quickly added, "for a divorce client. Complicated finances. If it weren't the wrecking ball to my own life, I might have found the irony funny." Victoria's gaze flicked between us, calculating. "How long have you been here, Henry?" "Just pulled in." "Why? No reason?" she said, flashing a smile that looked like it had been painted on. "You seem tense. Everything okay?" The woman who'd been plotting to gut me financially for months was asking about my well-being. I nearly laughed in her face. "Long day, you know how it is." I nodded toward Ethan. "Don't let me interrupt your work. We were just about finished," Ethan said, resting his hand casually and far too familiarly on the small of Victoria's back. The move looked instinctive. How long had that been going on? Good timing, then. I pulled out my phone to check the time, making sure they noticed. Neither of them flinched, though I caught Ethan's eyes flick briefly to the screen. I should get home anyway. Dinner won't make itself. Victoria's laugh came out thin and brittle. "I'll be along soon. Just need to wrap up a few things here. Take your time." I opened my car door, then paused like I just remembered something. "Oh, Victoria, Dr. Patterson's office called. They said they need to reschedule your physical. Something about a conflict with your work calendar." Her expression went blank for a fraction of a second, the look of someone who's just been caught. Then almost instantly, she recovered. "Must be a mix-up. I'll call them later." "No worries," I said. "These things happen." I slid into the driver's seat, my heart pounding. "See you both later." As I backed out, I checked the rearview mirror. They stood perfectly still until my car rounded the corner, then closed the gap between them, leaning in with urgent whispers. The triangle of deceit was complete. They probably suspected I'd overheard something. I knew they were out to dismantle me, and we were all still acting like life was perfectly normal. Victoria would drive home later, armed with some neat little story about why she left work early and why she was at Ethan's house. She might have already lined up a dozen plausible excuses before she even stepped through our front door. But she didn't know about the recording on my phone. 43 minutes of crystal clear audio that could blow everything wide open. I merged into traffic, my grip on the wheel steady for the first time in over an hour. The shock was fading, replaced with something colder, more deliberate. They thought they were playing chess against someone who only knew checkers. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. The 15-minute drive home blurred past in a haze of stoplights and muscle memory. My Honda rolled into our circular driveway without me even thinking about it. Past the manicured gardens Victoria insisted we hire someone to maintain. Past the fountain she'd demanded for our 20th anniversary. I sat there a long moment, staring at the house I'd built with my own hands back in '95. Every beam, every nail, every precise detail was a love letter to the woman who now schemed to steal it all. The front door opened onto a silence that no longer felt peaceful. It felt hollow. Victoria's voice had always filled these rooms with stories from her day, complaints about the neighbors' excitement over whatever she'd bought that week. Now I wondered how much of that had been nothing more than theater. My eyes landed on the wedding photo on the mantel, December 15th, 1987. Victoria, radiant in ivory silk, Me stiff, in a rented tux, both of us lit up with what I'd once believed was real happiness. She'd been 22, a secretary at Morrison & Associates downtown. I was 37, finally seeing my construction business turn a real profit after a decade of 12-hour days and dinners out of a styrofoam cup. We first crossed paths at the company's Christmas party that year. Morrison & Associates was one of my clients. I'd done a full office renovation for them the previous spring. Victoria had laughed at my corny joke about concrete mixers, the kind of laugh that rang out like silver chimes and hit me with an unexpected ache in my chest. When I asked her to dinner, she blushed and said yes, so quickly I couldn't help but wonder if she'd been waiting for me to ask. Our first date at Romano's Italian place went on until nearly midnight. She leaned in across the table, genuinely interested, as I talked about my dream of building something lasting, something that would stand long after we were gone. Her eyes lit up when I told her about the homes I wanted to design, the families I hoped would fill them. "You're not just building structures," she'd said, reaching over to take my hand. "You're building homes," I proposed 6 months later. The kitchen table still held our 25th anniversary card from last December, her handwriting still elegant in blue ink. "To my wonderful husband, thank you for making all my dreams come true. Here's to 25 more years of happiness. All my love, Victoria." All her love. The words were bitter now. I drifted into the living room, where Samantha's baby pictures lined the built-in shelves I'd crafted while Victoria was pregnant. June 8th, 1995. The day our daughter was born. Victoria, worn out but glowing, holding that red-faced little miracle like she was born for motherhood. Those early years had been the happiest of my life. She poured herself into being a mom with the same focus she'd once used to plan our wedding, school conferences, soccer matches, birthday parties, with themes that took weeks to prepare. She captured every moment on film with fierce pride. "You're the best father in the world," she told me the night Samantha graduated high school, tears streaking down her face as we watched our daughter accept her diploma. "She's going to do incredible things because of the foundation you gave her." The foundation I gave her, not we. Had the cracks been there even then? I sank into my old leather recliner, the one Victoria always said was too ugly for the living room, and let the memories roll over me. Our 10th anniversary cruise to Alaska, Victoria genuinely enchanted by the glaciers and the wildlife. Samantha's college graduation, all of us crying as she crossed the stage to collect her psychology degree. Christmas mornings packed with noise and laughter. Victoria insisting on extravagant decorations that took weeks to set up and just one day to tear down. When had gratitude turned into entitlement? When had "thank you for this life" become "we deserve more"? The recording on my phone held the answer. Victoria hadn't loved me in years, maybe decades. Every kiss, every anniversary dinner, every "I love you" whispered in the dark had been calculated. A long con to keep me working, earning, and building wealth she could one day walk away with. 25 years reduced to a legal playbook. I sat in the dim light of the living room, surrounded by proof of what I once believed was a happy marriage, feeling something cold and precise replace my grief. She thought she was running the long game, angling for maximum payout, while keeping her hands clean. She had no idea I possessed the same strategic mind that built a construction empire from nothing. The rules were about to change. I forced myself to think like the businessman I'd always been. When had she stopped being a partner and started being a tactician? The answer hit me fast. 2020, when Caldwell Construction landed the Morrison Municipal Center contract. $50 million over 3 years, the biggest job in company history. I'd come home that April evening expecting champagne, maybe a night out, at least the same excitement she'd shown for every milestone before. Instead, I found her at the kitchen table with a real estate catalog and a calculator. "This means we can finally get that house on Elm Street," she had said without even glancing up. "The one with the circular driveway and the pool. The Hendersons are asking $4.2 million. No congratulations. No pride in the work that would employ 300 people for the next 3 years. Just a laser focus on what my achievement could buy her. Victoria, I haven't even started the project yet. There's design work permits, subcontractor bids, but once the ink's dry, the money's locked in, right? That was when she finally looked up at me, those green eyes sharp and calculating. I mean, once you sign the contract, the city has to pay. We ended up talking for 2 hours. She had a spending plan laid out down to the penny, the new house. A country club membership, luxury cars, European getaways. Not our spending plan, hers. Even back then, the way she used pronouns told the real story, but I'd been too wrapped up in project logistics to hear it. By 2021, the wish list had become a set of demands. The country club membership was suddenly a must-have because the Pattersons had joined Riverside Hills. Our perfectly fine cabin in Wisconsin had somehow become embarrassing compared to the Johnsons' ski place in Aspen. Victoria started dropping little barbed comments about other wives whose husbands really knew how to treat a woman. Physical closeness faded away in slow motion. So gradual I blamed it on age and stress. We ended up in separate bedrooms, supposedly because of my snoring, even though she hadn't complained about it in 23 years of marriage. Dinner talk shifted from sharing our days to a running commentary on what other people had or showed off. Sarah Mitchell's husband bought her a Mercedes for their anniversary. She'd say slicing into her salmon with surgical precision because he appreciates everything she sacrificed for their marriage. Sacrificed as if living in comfort while I built my career had been some massive personal burden. After Samantha's wedding in September 2023, her friendship with Ethan suddenly ramped up. Out of nowhere, Victoria became fascinated with legal matters, tossing out hypothetical questions about property division and spousal rights for a friend who might need help. The phone calls started calls she always took in another room, claiming they were about her book club or volunteer work. How many of those calls had been strategy meetings? I pulled out my phone and replayed clips from today's recording. Ethan's voice. We've been documenting his assets for months. Victoria's laugh, 25 years of playing the devoted wife. Now, it all made sense, her sudden interest in my financial reports. The probing questions about business valuations, the insistence on joint accounts while keeping her own separate credit cards. She hadn't been making conversation. She'd been gathering intel. But Victoria made one critical miscalculation. She underestimated the man who built Caldwell Construction from a single truck and a borrowed toolkit. The same strategic brain that had survived 3 decades of labor disputes, municipal contracts, and multi-million-dollar builds was now locked onto a different kind of project. They thought they were playing chess against someone who didn't even know the rules. She'd been sliding her pieces into place for months, assuming I wasn't watching the board. She was about to learn that I knew the game better than she ever guessed. I pushed myself out of the recliner and headed for my home office, where 35 years of business records lined the built-in shelves. Tax returns, contracts, partnership agreements, property deeds, all the things she thought she was quietly collecting. But I knew something she didn't. The real assets weren't sitting in those binders. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name. I wanted Marcus Webb, my accountant, my friend, and the only person who knew about the offshore structures I'd set up years ago for tax optimization. Time to make the call that would change the board completely. 3 days of focused digging turned my home office into a full-blown war room. 2 laptops hummed on the mahogany desk I'd built 15 years ago, their screens glowing with bank statements, legal databases, and property records. Every flat surface was covered with yellow legal pads marked up with columns labeled assets, weaknesses, timeline, and leverage points. I'd shaved extra carefully that morning, slipped into my best navy blue suit, and put on the reading glasses Victoria always claimed made me look distinguished. Funny how grief can harden into strategy when you've got 35 years of business instincts to lean on. Marcus Webb had been even more useful than I could have hoped. 3 offshore accounts I'd set up years ago for tax efficiency, perfectly legal. Fully documented but invisible to anyone without deep forensic accounting skills. Victoria's little amateur spy mission had missed the true prize entirely. She'd been cataloging the obvious assets while the real crown jewels sat in plain sight. But she hadn't exactly been idle either. Her credit card records told quite the story. $47,000 in unauthorized transfers over 8 months, all funneled into a joint savings account I'd never even heard of. The beneficiary name made my jaw tighten: Ethan Reynolds. They'd been aligning themselves financially long before they ever got serious about their divorce scheme. There were the luxury lunches at Riverside Country Club, $300 spa sessions, designer purchases, suspiciously timed with her so-called book club meetings. Each line item sketched the outline of a woman planning for a very different future. The 8th Hermes handbag she'd bought just last Tuesday was almost laughable given she'd complained about the cost of groceries that very morning. But Ethan's vulnerabilities, those were even more telling. My contacts in the construction world had been generous with intel about Davenport's most ambitious attorney. The man plotting to take me down was sinking fast in debt, $180,000 in student loans, an $8,500 a month office lease, chosen for appearance over prudence, and a growing reputation for cutting ethical corners when the money got tight. Reynolds is a sharp lawyer. Jim Morrison from Morrison Concrete had told me over coffee. But he's got champagne taste on a beer budget. Owes 3 of my subs nearly $25,000. Always says he'll pay next week, then ghosts when the invoice is due. A quick check of the State Bar's site showed 2 dismissed ethics complaints in the past year, both tied to mishandling client funds. They'd been tossed out, but they were still on record. In legal circles, even a dismissed complaint left a scar. I leaned back in my leather chair, surveying the intelligence I'd gathered in 72 hours of quiet investigation. Victoria and Ethan had made a massive error in judgment. They saw a husband who worked long hours, never questioned household spending, and trusted too easily. They didn't see the strategist who'd built Caldwell Construction from one beat-up truck into a $12 million operation. The phone rang, snapping me out of my thoughts. Samantha's name lit up the screen. "Hey, sweetheart," I said warmly, keeping my tone light. "How's your day going?" "Dad, I need to ask you something." Her voice carried that careful, neutral tone she used with her more difficult patients. "Is everything okay between you and Mom? Lately there's been tension whenever you're both around." My grip on the phone tightened. How much did she already know? How much had Ethan told her? What makes you ask? Little things. Mom seems stressed about money, which is weird since business is doing so well. And Ethan keeps asking these odd questions about your company, like how the partnerships work, who controls what assets. She hesitated. "It's like they're fishing for information, but I can't figure out why." Fishing for information. My daughter's psychology training had picked up the predatory behavior her mother and husband thought they'd hidden so well. "Probably just curiosity about how business works," I said carefully. "Your mom's always been interested in financial security." "Maybe." But she didn't sound convinced. "Dad, if something was really wrong, you'd tell me, right?" The question hung between us like a live wire. Tell her what? That her mother was plotting to gut me financially. That her husband was masterminding the whole thing. That her family had been built on lights, of course, sweetheart. Everything's fine, just the usual business pressures. After we hung up, I sat staring at my notes. Ethan Reynolds had been working my daughter for information about my business structure. The reach of their little intelligence-gathering game was wider than I'd imagined. Time to make sure they got exactly the facts I wanted them to have. I was still mulling over Samantha's warning about Ethan digging for company details when my secure business line rang. Sarah Chen, my accountant for 12 years, sounded as crisp and direct as ever. "Henry, I've got the asset protection paperwork ready for you to sign. When you mentioned wanting to update your estate plan, I went ahead and researched the best possible structures." She paused. "This is about more than estate planning, isn't it? How perceptive of you. 28 years in forensic accounting teaches you to read between the lines. Should I ask what kind of threat we're insulating against?" "The domestic variety. Her silence said she understood she'd helped 3 of my site supervisors navigate messy divorces. "I'll have everything ready by noon," she said. "Once it's signed, the business assets will be untouchable in any personal legal action. Whoever's aiming to raid your finances won't even see where the real money is." By 10 o'clock, I was sitting across from Tom Bradley, president of First National Bank and my golf partner for 15 years. The mahogany conference room smelled faintly of coffee and leather, a familiar space where I'd negotiated more than a few multi-million-dollar construction loans. "Account security review," I said, sliding a folder across the polished table. "I need every joint access point verified and temporarily frozen until ID is confirmed." His brows lifted slightly. "This is thorough, Henry. You're talking about every joint account credit line automatic payment, every single one. May I ask?" "You may not." I smiled when I said it. "How soon do the holds take effect?" "Immediately after you sign. All account holders will be notified that in-person verification with photo ID and secondary proof will be required to regain access." Tom gave me a long look. "This is going to inconvenience Victoria quite a bit. I'm counting on it." The holds went live at 11:47 a.m., right as Victoria was settling in for her weekly lunch at Riverside Country Club with 3 other construction wives. At 12:03, my phone lit up with the first decline transaction alert. By 12:50, I was reviewing contractor bids when the call came in. "Henry, something's wrong with our accounts. My card was declined at lunch, and when I called the bank, they said there's a security hold." "Do you know anything about this?" She sounded perfectly innocent. No mention of the joint account with Ethan's name on it. No acknowledgement of the missing 47 grand. No hint that she'd been siphoning money without my knowledge. Security hold? That sounds serious. Did they say what triggered it? Something about verifying identity and account access. It's humiliating, Henry. I'm sitting here with Linda, Susan, and Janet, and I can't even pay for my own lunch. The distress in her tone was real, but not because the scheme was in jeopardy. No, she was upset because her social standing had taken a public hit. After 25 years of marriage, I knew exactly where Victoria's priorities lay. "I'll call Tom Bradley right away," I told her. "We'll get this sorted out." I didn't call Tom. Instead, I drove to the job site where my crew was pouring the medical center foundation. The thrum of machinery and the banter of the guys on site was grounding after 3 days of financial chess moves. My phone buzzed with texts all afternoon. "Victoria, 1:47 p.m. Still can't get into any accounts. This is ridiculous." "Victoria, 2:23 p.m. Tom's secretary says he's in meetings all day. What kind of bank president ignores his best customers?" "Victoria, 3:15 p.m. Even the emergency credit line is frozen. How am I supposed to buy groceries?" Every message brought a quiet satisfaction. For a quarter century, she'd treated financial stability as her birthright, while I worked 60-hour weeks to make it happen. Now she was getting a first-hand taste of what it felt like when that safety net disappeared overnight. Ethan's reaction, though, turned out to be even more telling. At 4:30 p.m., my private investigator, Mike Rodriguez, called with an update. "Reynolds tried to get into the joint account he shares with your wife 3 times this afternoon. When that failed, he went after what looks like a trust account. Likely your daughter's education fund that he's been managing. That one's locked down too, per your instructions." Mike described Ethan's demeanor. Angry calls to bank reps, threats of lawsuits demanding to speak with top management. The textbook meltdown of an overconfident attorney, realizing his leverage just went up in smoke. By 6 o'clock, I was home reviewing the day's financial battlefield from my office. Every shared account frozen, every joint credit line suspended, every automatic payment now needing my direct authorization. Victoria's access to 25 years of accumulated wealth had been reduced to whatever cash she happened to have in her wallet. The measures were completely legal, a husband safeguarding marital assets during an estate planning review. Tom Bradley could vouch that every step followed standard banking protocol. But Victoria and Ethan wouldn't need an explanation. they'd get the message loud and clear. The man they planned to gut financially was no longer just defending himself. At 6:47 p.m., my phone lit up with Victoria's number. When I answered, the voice on the line wasn't smooth or manipulative anymore. It was strained, urgent. I was about to find out how quickly partners in a scheme turned on each other when the walls started closing in. At 7:15 p.m., Victoria stormed through the lobby of Thompson & Associates, her heels striking the marble in quick, frantic beats. The after-hours security guard barely glanced up. I knew the timing and pace because Mike was camped in the coffee shop across the street watching the entrance with a clear line of sight. The call she'd made from our driveway, Ethan. "We need to talk right now. Something's gone terribly wrong," had been loud enough for our next-door neighbor to catch every word. Discretion wasn't even a thought in her mind anymore. On the 14th floor, Ethan's corner office blazed with after-hours urgency. From the street, anyone with binoculars could see the two of them leaning over a table, buried in paperwork, their posture radiating pure damage control. He knows. Thanks to the building's old ventilation system, Victoria's voice carried straight into the office of a contact Mike had next door. "Henry knows something. He's cutting us off from everything. I couldn't even put gas in my car." Ethan's tone was clipped and all business, his litigation voice in full force. "The timing's no accident. 3 days ago, you told me he showed up at Samantha's place right in the middle of our strategy talk. He must have overheard." "How much could he have heard?" she asked. "Enough to know exactly what's going on. We can't pretend anymore." "And Margaret," he caught himself. "Victoria, we have to assume he recorded us. Every word, the assets, the timeline, the plan, all of it could be on tape." The pause that followed said it all. Two co-conspirators suddenly realizing their victim had been playing several moves ahead while they'd been patting themselves on the back. "What do we do?" Victoria's voice no longer had its earlier bite. "We move faster. Forget the slow approach. No more easing into position. We go all in now. Monday morning, I file for an emergency divorce petition requesting immediate spousal support. Our claim that Henry's been committing financial abuse by cutting you off from marital assets." "Financial abuse?" Victoria's voice sharpened with interest. "That sounds like it would hold up in court." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. We'll frame him as a controlling husband who uses money as a weapon, manipulating and intimidating you. The frozen accounts. Evidence of his abusive pattern, not a defensive move." More papers shuffled the air, thick with the scent of a plan shifting into full-blown attack mode. "I'll need you to keep a detailed record of any emotional abuse, financial control, intimidation. Think back over your marriage every time Henry made a financial decision without you. Every time he questioned your spending, every time he used money to steer your choices." "That's going to be a stretch," Victoria admitted. "Henry's never been stingy. If anything, he's gone overboard being generous." "Then we turn that generosity into proof of manipulation," Ethan replied smoothly. "The way he provided for you becomes evidence that he deliberately made you financially dependent so he could hold the reins. Every gift, every vacation, every cushy lifestyle upgrade. We'll spin it as part of his long-term isolation strategy." The sheer boldness was breathtaking. They were about to twist 25 years of Henry's loyalty and generosity into a case for abuse. "What about Samantha?" Victoria asked. "She's not automatically going to take my side. Her psychology background makes her question everything." "That's actually perfect," Ethan said with the smugness of a man landing his closing argument. "Her hesitation proves how deep Henry's manipulation runs. We'll present it as him exploiting her training to turn your own daughter against you emotionally. You want to use our daughter as a witness against her father? I want to secure your financial future, Victoria. Samantha's credentials give her testimony extra punch. If she voices any concerns about family dynamics, we'll frame it as expert psychological insight, confirming Henry's manipulative patterns. It was diabolically tidy flip the daughter's professional skepticism into ammunition against the father reframe affection as control turned financial protection into evidence of abuse. Monday morning, Ethan continued. I also file for emergency restraining orders to stop him from moving assets. Spousal support at $15,000 a month and temporary sole occupancy of the house. By Wednesday, we'll have him looking like an abusive husband who needs the court breathing down his neck. If he pushes back, we escalate. Harassment charges if he calls you directly. Stalking allegations if he tries to track what we're doing. Emotional abuse claims if he questions any of our statements. Ethan's voice dripped with cold satisfaction. The beauty of domestic abuse law, he said, is that the harder he denies it, the more controlling he looks. Victoria's laugh had no warmth. Poor Henry. 25 years playing the devoted husband. Time to teach him that nice guys finish last. They spent another hour syncing their stories, setting up secure ways to communicate, and mapping out what Ethan called total legal warfare. Every conversation, every interaction, every bank transfer would be fed into the narrative of Henry's alleged abuse. The scheme had grown from a simple asset grab into a full-blown character assassination aimed at destroying not just Henry's finances, but his reputation, his relationship with Samantha, and his standing in the community he'd been part of for 3 decades. When Victoria finally walked out at 9:30 p.m., her phone was already buzzing with Ethan's first tactical text. Remember, you're not the angry wife anymore. You're the terrified victim, finally finding the courage to escape your abuser. The war had officially begun. Saturday morning, Victoria and Samantha sat at Cafe Luna, the cozy spot they'd met at every month for brunch over the past 5 years. Victoria had chosen their usual corner booth. Private, familiar, perfect for conversations meant to stay between them. But today she was casting herself as a client, seeking professional advice, not a mother seeking comfort. Samantha, I need to talk to you about your father. Victoria's voice was tuned to just the right note of vulnerability. I think there's something wrong with him mentally. Samantha set her coffee cup down with the kind of deliberate care she used when switching into therapist mode. What kind of wrong mom controlling behaviors? Paranoia. He's been limiting my access to our accounts, saying it's for security. Victoria let her voice taper off, inviting her daughter's mind to fill the gaps. How long has this been going on? Months, maybe longer. I chalked it up to stress from work. But yesterday, he locked me out of every account we have together. I couldn't even buy lunch. Samantha leaned in, her training kicking in despite the family stakes. Mom financial control can be a form of domestic abuse, but it can also be legitimate asset management during business shifts or legal situations. What's Dad's explanation? The question was too clinical, too stripped of emotion. Victoria had been expecting sympathy, not a therapy session. He says it's just standard account security, but Samantha, I've been married to this man for 25 years. This is not standard. This feels like punishment for something. Punishment for what Victoria hesitated, weighing how much she could reveal without tipping her hand about the larger plan. I think he suspects I've been questioning our marriage. Maybe this is his way of intimidating me into staying. Mom. Samantha's voice carried the calm patience of someone used to dealing with manipulative clients. Are you telling me Dad's cutting you off financially to stop a divorce? Or that you're thinking about leaving? And he's just protecting assets? The line was too close to the truth. Victoria shifted her angle. I'm telling you, your father's been showing some troubling behavioral changes. And as a psychologist, I thought you might have insight into what's going on. As a psychologist, I'd say major behavior changes usually have clear triggers. So, what happened 3 days ago that might have made Dad suddenly restrict the accounts? Victoria's mind scrambled. Samantha wasn't falling for emotional bait. Every question poked holes in her carefully built victim story. I don't know what set him off. That's what scares me. But Samantha's eyes stayed cool, analyzing her mother's face, reading micro-expressions, catching tiny verbal slips with practiced precision. Mom, are you asking for professional advice, or are you asking me to pick a side in your marriage? The bluntness cut right through Victoria's strategy. Samantha wasn't going to hand her the emotional backing she needed to prop up her claims. I'm asking you to help me understand what's happening to our family. Then my advice is to have a direct, honest conversation with Dad about his concerns, rather than asking me to diagnose him based on your interpretation of events. Victoria left Café Luna 20 minutes later, seething over her daughter's clinical detachment and quietly panicking about what it meant. If Samantha wouldn't immediately back her, the entire abused wife narrative could crumble under professional scrutiny. Meanwhile, 40 minutes away, at Caldwell Construction's main office, I was getting intel that would change the entire playing field. My phone rang at 10:15 a.m., just as I was reviewing the weekend site reports. Henry thought you'd want to hear this, said Jim Morrison. Ethan Reynolds has some heat coming his way from the state bar. What kind of heat word is there looking into how he handled contractor payments on the Mitchell project? 3 subs filed complaints last month claiming Reynolds took client money, but never paid them. If they prove it, it's a textbook trust account violation. I set my coffee down, my mind already running the calculations on how this could shift the entire war. How bad is it? Bad enough that the Bar Association has already set a hearing for next week, Jim said. Reynolds is scrambling to come up with $23,000 to square things with the subcontractors before they wrap up the investigation. $23,000, the exact figure Ethan owed, based on my own digging. Jim, would those subs be open to talking about their dealings with Reynolds if someone from the construction world reached out? Absolutely. They're furious. He's been stringing them along for half a year, always an excuse, always blaming the client or court delays. These are small shops. They can't eat those losses. I spent the next 3 hours making pointed, well-placed calls. Bob Martinez of Martinez Electrical still waiting 8 months for his $7,400. Steve Chen of Chen Plumbing shorted $9,200 since last October. Randy Foster of Foster Roofing, $6,500 unpaid from a job wrapped up in November. Each call played out the same way, a polite just checking references. Inquiry from Caldwell Construction before considering hiring Ethan Reynolds for legal work. And each contractor was eager to unload sharing stories about Ethan's shady payment habits, shortcuts on ethics, and overall unreliability. By 1 o'clock, I had a paper trail showing a consistent pattern, Reynolds dipping into client trust accounts, like they were his personal ATM, breaking bar rules and feeding subcontractors a steady diet of false promises. At 2:30 p.m., I called the State Bar's ethics hotline. I'd like to file a formal complaint regarding attorney misconduct, I told the intake specialist. Ethan Reynolds has repeatedly violated client trust account rules and misrepresented payment timelines to construction professionals. They asked for details. I gave them names, amounts owed, a timeline of lies, and proof of Reynolds' systematic misuse of client funds. 3 more subcontractors even volunteered to testify if needed. By 4:00 p.m., Reynolds' office was fielding calls from the bar about fast-tracking the investigation and mandating his appearance at the hearing. His reputation, the very pillar of his scheme against me, was now under official review. At 4:47, my phone buzzed. A text from Mike Rodriguez. Reynolds just walked out with 3 boxes of files, heading to his car. Want me to tail him? No need, I typed back. I know exactly where he's headed. Ethan would beeline straight to Victoria, panic shoving aside whatever calculated caution he usually had. What started as a well-oiled plot was about to become a chaotic scramble. Let them sweat. Let them trip over themselves. The real fight was just starting. 2 days of watching her mother's scheme unravel had given Samantha plenty of time to think. The drive to Caldwell Construction felt like she was heading toward a reckoning she'd dodged her entire life. My building stood solid against the April sky, brick, steel, honest craftsmanship. Everything Ethan's sleek glass tower pretended to be, but wasn't. Sarah, my secretary of 8 years, lit up when she saw Samantha like greeting family who actually showed up at job sites and company barbecues. "He's expecting you, sweetheart. Go right in." I stood when she walked in, studying her posture with the same careful read I'd used to gauge Victoria's moods for 25 years. But Samantha was different now. Shoulders squared, her expression all professional composure. "Dad, we need to talk about what's going on between you and Mom." Her voice was the calm, measured tone she used with difficult clients. "I've spent the last 2 days analyzing everything, and I need to hear your side. What's your mother told you? That you're showing controlling behaviors? Manipulating finances, possibly crossing into emotional abuse?" She sat across from me, hands neatly folded. She wants me to back her victim story with my professional credentials. Hearing that clinical phrasing from my own daughter was jarring, but I recognized the tactic, keep emotional distance to weigh the facts. "And what do you think? I think Mom's been trying to manipulate me the same way she's apparently been manipulating you." Samantha's green eyes, Victoria's eyes, but sharper, held steady on mine. "Show me what you've got, Dad. I want to hear exactly what you heard." I hesitated. Playing that recording would strip away any last illusions she had about her mother and her stepfather. But Samantha was 30, a licensed psychologist. She could handle the truth. I hit play. Victoria's voice spilled into the office. "When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for." Samantha's face didn't shift for the first full minute. That practiced professional detachment stayed in place as she listened, her mother mocking 25 years of marriage. Ethan mapping out legal tactics to inflict the most financial damage, the two of them coolly dissecting a timeline for asset division. But when Victoria's voice said, 25 years of playing the devoted wife, a small crack appeared. Her hands clenched once before easing again. The recording ended. Silence stretched between us, taut as a bridge neither of us wanted to cross first. "How long have you known?" she finally asked. 6 days, I said. "I overheard it at your place last Tuesday, and you've been—" "What, quietly building your defense while pretending nothing's wrong?" "Something like that." She leaned back, processing. "Mom asked me to assess your mental state. She wanted me to give a professional opinion that you were showing patterns of abuse." "What did you tell her? That I couldn't ethically evaluate someone without a proper assessment? And that what she described didn't match your long-standing behavioral patterns?" Now Samantha's voice had an edge. "She tried to turn my training into a weapon, Dad, against you and against my profession." The betrayal hung heavy, not just hers toward me, but her mother's toward her. "I'm sorry you got pulled into this, sweetheart." "I'm not," she said, her tone sharpening with resolve. "I'm glad I know the truth. The real question is, what happens next?" I studied her, saw the strength I'd tried to nurture in her and the independence I could never control. "That's up to you, Samantha. I'm not asking you to pick sides. I already have." She stood her decision solid. "I choose truth over family loyalty. I choose evidence over emotion. And I choose to stand with the parent who didn't try to twist my professional ethics." Relief washed through me, chased quickly by worry. "What about Ethan? What about him?" Her voice went cold. "My husband joined a scheme to financially wipe out my father, using my psychology practice as cover. That marriage is finished." "Samantha." "Dad, this isn't about anger. It's about character, and the behavioral evidence is conclusive." She stepped toward the door, then paused. I'll testify truthfully about our family dynamics if I have to. But I won't be anyone's weapon, not even yours. I understand. Good, because there's something else I need to take care of. She left with the steady stride of someone who'd found moral clarity in the middle of a storm meant to destroy it. 20 minutes later, she'd be unlocking her own front door, ready to face the man who had betrayed both her father and the professional ethics she'd worked years to uphold. I stayed in my office surrounded by the proof of 35 years of honest work, feeling something I hadn't felt since all this began. Hope that truth might actually matter. At 7:30 p.m., Samantha's key turned in the lock. Ethan looked up, startled. He clearly hadn't expected her home early. He was sprawled on the living room couch, legal files scattered across the coffee table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey within reach. "We need to talk," she said, placing her purse down with precise intent. "Rough day," he muttered, not glancing up from the file he pretended to read. The Barrett deposition got postponed again. "I know about the conspiracy, Ethan." His head jerked up, the polished lawyer's mask, slipping to reveal something raw underneath. "What conspiracy?" "The one where you and my mother plotted to financially ruin my father while using my credentials to back false abuse claims." She stayed standing, keeping the upper hand. I heard the recording. Every word. He set his glass down slowly, trying for composure. "Samantha, I think you're misunderstanding. 25 years of playing the devoted wife. Sound familiar?" The color drained from his face. Ethan Reynolds, a man who could argue before the state Supreme Court without breaking a sweat, suddenly looked like someone watching his entire life collapse. "How much did you hear?" "Everything. The asset split strategy, your timeline, the fee, math, even Mom's performance reviews." I sat across from him, keeping my tone measured and my posture neutral. Was our entire marriage just a setup for this? 3 days later, Victoria learned that social fallout traveled faster than court filings. The dining room at Riverside Country Club hummed with the usual Saturday brunch chatter until small clusters of women went quiet the moment she neared their tables. Linda Patterson, her bridge partner for half a decade, suddenly found her eggs Benedict riveting when Victoria stopped to greet her. Susan Morrison faked an urgent phone call just to break off their conversation. By the time Victoria reached her usual table, she knew the scheme wasn't a secret anymore. "Victoria, dear," Janet Crawford's voice dripped with polite venom. "We missed you at the planning committee meeting yesterday." "What meeting?" "No one told me." "Oh, you didn't get the message. We had to make a few organizational changes." "You understand." She was starting to recognize the rhythm now calls that never got returned, invitations quietly withdrawn, social doors shutting with whispered precision. Meanwhile, my own campaign was rolling along with far better results. 35 years of fair dealing had earned me credibility no lawsuit could erase. Lunch with Tom Bradley over at the bank turned out to be more than just friendly. I shared a few guarded concerns about family issues, giving just enough detail to make my point without sounding bitter. "It seems Victoria and our son-in-law have been making some questionable plans regarding my assets," I said over coffee. "I've had to take some precautionary steps." Tom's face was exactly what I'd hoped for, a mix of professional understanding and personal sympathy for someone blindsided by family betrayal. That night, the Chamber of Commerce board meeting was just as fruitful. When Jim Morrison asked why Victoria had skipped the recent fundraiser dinner, I explained truthfully that some troubling realities about my marriage had come to light. Sometimes, I said, letting my voice carry the weight of disappointment, you find out people aren't who you thought they were. 2 years into marriage, and it turns out she had a plan all along. Well, I added, I'm grateful I learned when I did. By Sunday night, Victoria's social exile was complete. The country club membership committee put her on the agenda for a routine review. The charity board announced her resignation from posts she never actually resigned from. At the same time, Ethan's professional unraveling sped up to match her social downfall. 3 big clients cut ties, citing concerns about judgment and ethical integrity. Miller Industries, worth $200,000 a year, sent a formal notice of lost confidence in his professional discretion. Victoria's frantic Sunday night phone call to Ethan carried enough panic to cut through their apartment's thin walls. Everyone knows Ethan. Everyone. I can't show my face anywhere in this town. We'll file emergency motions Monday morning to force Henry into defense mode. Before what? Before you lose your law license. Before I end up moving back to my sister's place in Minnesota. Their mutual blame session went until midnight, 2 partners in crime realizing that shared guilt was no substitute for a solution. Tomorrow they'd throw one last desperate punch. I was ready. Monday morning, Victoria walked into the downtown office of Linda Hawthorne, a divorce attorney known for her scorched earth tactics and equally high fees. The glass-walled conference room overlooked the courthouse, where she hoped to crush me. Mrs. Caldwell. Linda began flipping through the file, her voice cool with skepticism. I've reviewed your documents. Your husband's financial safeguards appear to be well within legal limits. Joint account holders can restrict access during marital disputes, but that's financial abuse. Victoria pressed her voice, betraying the edges of her victim performance. He's controlling every penny I have access to, money we earned together. Money he earned according to tax records going back 25 years. Linda checked her notes. Your personal income appears minimal. You haven't worked outside the home since 1989. Color rose in Victoria's cheeks. What had once felt like a badge of comfort and security was now being recast as proof of dependency. What about emotional abuse? Intimidation, isolation? What specific incidents can you document? The question lingered like a weight in the room. Victoria had spent sleepless nights trying to retrofit an abuse story into 25 years of my steady generosity. He's always been controlling about money. Can you give examples of threats, physical intimidation, preventing you from seeing friends or family? Well, no. But Mrs. Caldwell, abuse claims require evidence. Has your husband ever physically threatened you? Kept you from leaving or monitored your communications? Each question punched another hole in her fabrication. I'd never raised my voice in anger, never clipped her freedom, never questioned her relationships. 10 blocks away, Ethan was learning that the Bar Association could move at lightning speed when they were motivated. Monday morning's ethics committee call hinted at trouble that went far beyond a few unpaid contractor invoices. Mr. Reynolds, we've received additional complaints regarding your handling of client trust accounts, the bar investigator said, evenly. Specifically, there are allegations you've been using client funds for personal expenses while cases were still pending. Ethan's grip on the phone tightened. Those accusations are baseless. My books are clean. We have documentation from Martinez Electrical showing invoices submitted 8 months ago, with repeated assurances that payment was just waiting on client approval. Yet your client's settlement cleared 6 months ago. And where are those funds now? The real answer was ugly. The money had been shifted into his personal checking account to cover office rent and chip away at student loans. What he'd once framed to himself as smart cash flow management now had an uglier name: embezzlement. There may have been some administrative delays, he said. Mr. Reynolds, we're scheduling a formal hearing for Thursday morning. You'll need to bring complete financial records for all client accounts going back 18 months. By Wednesday evening, Victoria and Ethan had reached the kind of desperation that breeds reckless moves. Their emergency strategy meeting in Ethan's nearly stripped-down office felt like 2 generals plotting a last-ditch assault without a single round of ammunition. We have to file domestic violence claims, Victoria said, her voice lined with false conviction. It's the only way to force him into a defensive corner. Victoria, false domestic violence charges can get us felony convictions if we're exposed, especially with whatever evidence Henry's sitting on. What evidence, she shot back. I've never said anything in front of cameras or witnesses that... She stopped mid-sentence, the recording that had kicked off this spiral flashing through her mind. That recording proves we were discussing financial strategy, not abuse. Ethan reminded her. Then we shift the angle, she insisted. You handle the legal framing, I'll give the testimony. We make it about long-term emotional manipulation and financial control. Ethan stared at her from across the table. 6 months ago, she'd been a restless housewife chasing drama. Now she was pushing for perjury in federal court. If this doesn't work, we're both staring down criminal charges. If we don't try, I'm staring at poverty and you're staring at disbarment, she replied, her tone cold and calculating. At least this way, we go down swinging. Thursday morning's restraining order hearing would be their Hail Mary, either a last-minute save or one more stack of evidence for my case. What neither of them realized was that I'd spent the past week documenting everything. Every call, every whispered meeting, every lie they'd fed to friends and lawyers alike. I wasn't just defending myself anymore. I was building a prosecution. The Davenport County Courthouse felt different on May 1st. 35 years of honest reputation had taken on a weight I could carry like armor. Judge Patricia Hendricks ran her courtroom with crisp efficiency, having seen every flavor of family deception pass through her docket. Victoria sat at the plaintiff's table beside Linda Hawthorne, dressed like she'd taken cues from a How to Look Like a Battered Wife manual. Muted dress light, makeup hands folded just so. Whether her nervous look was genuine or calculated was anyone's guess. Mrs. Caldwell, Judge Hendricks, began scanning the emergency restraining order petition. You allege your husband engaged in financial abuse and intimidation. Can you describe specific incidents that led you to fear for your safety? Victoria's voice quivered with carefully rehearsed vulnerability. Your Honor, for months, my husband has restricted my access to our accounts, monitored my spending, and made threats about what would happen if I tried to leave. What kind of threats, Mrs. Caldwell? Financial threats that I'd be left with nothing. That he'd use his business connections to destroy my reputation. She paused just long enough for effect. Last week, he completely cut me off from money, even for basic needs. I watched my wife of 25 years pile lie on top of lie, constructing an image of abuse out of decades of my steady provision and generosity. Judge Hendricks turned to my attorney, James Morrison. Does the defendant wish to respond? James rose with the calm authority of a man who'd spent 30 years practicing law without ever crossing into perjury. Your Honor. James began, his voice steady, but edged with steel. We have evidence that Mrs. Caldwell's claims are not only false, but part of an intentional scheme to strip the defendant of marital assets. That's a serious accusation, Counselor, Judge Hendricks replied. We have an audio recording of Mrs. Caldwell and her co-conspirator Ethan Reynolds discussing this exact plan 6 weeks ago. Victoria's face drained of color. Her attorney, Linda Hawthorne, leaned in and whispered urgently. But there's no salvaging a case built entirely on lies. I'd like to enter Exhibit A. James continued connecting his phone to the courtroom's sound system. Victoria's voice filled the room. When the old fool finally signs the papers, we'll have everything we planned for. For the next 43 minutes, Judge Hendricks listened to the conspiracy unfold. In full Victoria mocking our marriage, Ethan outlining his legal tactics for seizing assets, their calculated plan to use Samantha's credentials in psychology as a weapon. The man actually believes I love him, Victoria's recorded voice said, dripping with casual cruelty. I watched her carefully crafted victim story dissolve in real time. Her coached testimony about fearing for her safety became laughable when played against her own recorded laughter about manipulating the old fool. Judge Hendricks stopped the recording. Mrs. Caldwell, do you have any response to this evidence? Victoria opened her mouth, but no words came. Linda's complexion had gone pale as she realized she'd been used to file false claims in court. "Your Honor," Linda said carefully, "I respectfully request to withdraw from this case. I was unaware of these facts when I accepted representation." "Motion granted," the judge said. Then she turned a hard stare on Victoria, the kind she reserved for liars who took an oath in vain. "Mrs. Caldwell, I am dismissing your restraining order petition with prejudice. Furthermore, I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office for possible perjury charges." The gavel came down with a crack that echoed through the courtroom. 2 weeks later, the divorce settlement made clear the magnitude of Victoria's miscalculation. The documented deception stripped her of any right to spousal support, and the prenuptial agreement she'd signed so eagerly in 1979 limited her to a minimal share of the assets. Ethan's temporary law license suspension became a permanent revocation when the bar uncovered $127,000 in missing client funds. Last I heard, he'd packed up for Nebraska and was working as a paralegal. Samantha filed for divorce the day after the hearing, citing irreconcilable differences. She's now building a new counseling practice specializing in family therapy and the detection of manipulative behavior. 6 months later, Victoria works in retail at the same mall where she used to spend my money on designer goods. The irony is not lost on either of us. I've rebuilt Caldwell Construction stronger than ever. The community support during my family crisis turned into new contracts and deeper relationships with people who matter. The house feels different now, quieter but real. No more scripted conversations, no more affection measured out like a bargaining chip. Just the rain on the windows, I installed myself in a home that's finally mine again. Victoria had been right about one thing. I truly had believed she loved me. Now I understand the difference between love and performance. If you like this story, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, click on the box to the left. Thanks for watching.